thing.
No, Allah, we all are students of ilm. Even though this quote, I'll give you a quote. It's not an authentic hadith, but I'm still going to mention it. اطلب العلم من المهد إلى اللحد. We all. Okay. What does it mean? Seek ilm from the day of your cradle till the day of your burial. The hadith is not authentic, okay? So that way you won't, say, I've got a hadith, seeking ilm from the cradle till the burial, even though it's not authentic hadith, but I love the meaning, from the cradle till the burial, always seek ilm. Okay, my friends. So we are doing still the tafsir that we did yesterday. We kind of went in lots of details about the word إِلَّا أُمَمٌ أَمْثَالُكُمْ, and we could have just swiftly made that explanation and said, well, أُمَمٌ أَمْثَالُكُمْ just means different nations in terms of animals and so forth. But then, we needed to go and see what the scholars of tafsir say, even if we may not necessarily see that al-Qurtubi is necessarily agreeing with them, but we would want to see the inspiration of what they had said. And our favorite inspiration was when I believe it was Sufyan al-Thawri, and he had said that that's giving us the inference and for us to learn that people may have different characteristics of different animals, and therefore Al-Khattabi had said, maybe I need to find it, and I'm trying to find it. Okay, and Al-Khattabi had said, well, that's for us to basically learn that since here it is, Al-Khattabi had said, then since you are living and you're surrounded by people that may have traits of domestic animals and others of wild animals, just be cautious, as if you're living in a jungle, and not necessarily let that get you to become a wild person like them, or an animal their, or at least animal features like them. So we like that one, and it doesn't necessarily fully mean that, but I guess I would say it's more of a those, they call them nukat or mulah. Okay, so that was one thing. ما فرطنا في الكتاب من شيء, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not leave anything within the book. And then we went into details. Is this kitab? Is this referring to al-Lawh al-Mahfuz, which is basically the holy book that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had written everything in it and predestined and predetermined everything, or pre-decreed, I should say, to predestined is more accurate than predetermined, because to determine would actually mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forces you to take certain actions, but predestined, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically known that everything and what's going to happen. The ones to have free will were basically the human beings. And let's say the other interpretation is that this is referring to the Quran, and therefore for you to actually see as an evidence about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and what relates to proving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we went into details about those that had suggested that this is referring to the Quran, and they said, well, we could see in Surah Al-Nahl, نزلنا عليك الكتاب تبيانا لكل شيء, that the Quran, or the word al-kitab, which was indicating that this is referring to the Quran in that context, that it was to reveal about everything. And here's the word likulli shay. Is the Quran necessarily talking about everything? No, it's not necessarily talking about everything. So therefore, likulli shay, meaning all the different matters that relate to the purpose that we were created for. So you're not going to find any information about science or any information about perhaps things that relate to people's lives that is not relevant to akhirah, but the things that are relevant to akhirah, that's what you're going to find an inspiration within the Quran that contains the revelation of what we're supposed to be doing. So that's why that ayah, وَمَا أَتَاكُمُ الرَّسُولُ فَخُذُوهُ وَمَا نَهَاكُمْ عَنْهُ فَانْتَهُوا, well, giving us that paradigm, giving us that inspiration to tell us what was revealed onto the Prophet ﷺ and what the Prophet ﷺ had come with, that you're basically supposed to be taking it as an inspiration, as something that you apply in life. Now, one thing, what's another evidence that certain things in life, they're not relevant, if they're not relevant to the akhirah, that we could just basically put in our own experience, our own, I guess, take and our own way of learning how things function. Let's look at a story. So the Prophet ﷺ was a businessman, a shepherd in Mecca. In other words, when he went to Medina, the people there were farmers. They were growing crops basically on palm trees and doing basically because the land in Mecca wasn't fertile, so they couldn't really use that soil for cropping. So they had to find another way for making a living, basically. And that's why the people of Mecca were pretty much businessmen and dependent on trade. The people of Medina were different because the soil there was fertile, the soil and the temperature was great, and they were capable of using that for farming and basically engaging in that. So when the Prophet ﷺ went to Medina, his information about cropping is definitely not as the way that he would learn about it if he were to grow around that area. So then they were doing something that the Prophet ﷺ had seen, that they were hitting against the trunk trees and hitting against the trunk trees, one trunk tree after another. So the Prophet ﷺ had told them not to hit the trunk tree because the Prophet ﷺ was teaching them that just as umamun amthalukum, just as we were talking about the animals, birds are basically like nations. In other words, you have to be gentle with everything, even if it's a plant. But the following year, they came to the Prophet ﷺ and they complained that they didn't actually get the crops they had anticipated, and that the crops basically were affected. And the main reason for that is really because they were not beating against the trunk trees. And then they explained to the Prophet ﷺ the object for hitting onto the trunk of those trees was in order to help with pollination. So that's when the Prophet ﷺ, after learning about why they were hitting on the trunk trees and how that basically lets them pollinate and what it does and how many trees you have to have of a male tree to be equivalent for a female tree and all of that, that's when the Prophet ﷺ just said, أَنْتُمْ أَعْلَمُ بِأُمُورِ دُنْيَاكُمْ. You would know more about the matters that relate to your life, and therefore you would know better in relationship to the things that does not relate to the akhirah, but relates to probably making a better, whether it's production in terms of perhaps crops, or probably just different matters. Now, this actually helps us understand that there are certain matters that we need to do ijtihad on and take in consideration basically what probably psychiatrists would tell us about certain mental illnesses, or probably medical doctors, or probably economists, or probably politicians, etc. We would need their expertise to be invested in making a better community, in making basically the fulfillment of what Islam had given us. Let's call them general paradigms to understanding justice. Now, this is important. The Quran and the Sunnah had given us general paradigms, but the details, that how we would, think of it as a quilt, or think of it as, I guess, when you're doing like a crochet type of thing, you're doing the crochet, but then it's one hole and one hole and one hole, and then you're putting in this thread to connect this crochet with the other one, and you're basically putting them together. Think of Islam and think of fiqh as basically this thread that puts in these pieces together in order for us to understand how we fill in those different gaps in our life to make a complete makeup of justice, a complete makeup that is founded on the lens of how we see justice through the lens of Quran and Sunnah. Okay, then we talked about ثُمَّ إِلَىٰ رَبِّهِمْ يُحْشَرُونَ. Is this referring? So let's say it's right here, this ayah, at least part of the ayah, ثُمَّ إِلَىٰ رَبِّهِمْ يُحْشَرُونَ. Is this referring to that animals and birds basically are going to be just as they're umamun amthalukum, that we have similarities with animals, such as perhaps worship, certain inspiration, certain behaviors, probably a certain amount of free will. A certain amount of free will. Where did you get that from? Well, a certain amount of free will, because we've got free will, and the free will that we have is basically what is going to determine what we're going to be judged in. In other words, held accountable for on Judgment Day. Okay? Once that free will that relates to human beings, once that is in any shape or form taken away from us, that's when we're not held accountable. Like what? Explain it. Well, like, for example, if you were coerced to do something, now you're not practicing your free will, but someone else is practicing their free will and forcing you to practice something in a certain way. Number two, if, for example, you didn't have the free will due to an illness, you wanted to do sujood, but then your free will right now to have the ability and the capacity to do sujood is not there anymore. Your body is disabling you and disabling your will and your ability to basically put that will into practice. So in that situation, we would say Islam comes in and says, okay, because your disability, since your free will is not entirely yours, then we're going to take that into consideration when we would consider accountability. Now, within this context of this ayah, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِلَّا أُمَمٌ أَمْثَالُكُمْ, does that mean that animals also have free will? Well, when you look at, for example, these ahadith, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically hold the animal that doesn't have horns and got hit, basically had a head fight basically with another animal that has horns, or probably that was attacked, or just different things. We may not know why they were basically attacking each other for, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically knows. And in other words, because they had a certain amount of will, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically hold them accountable, a certain amount of will. Okay, would hold them accountable, and based on that, the Lord Almighty would basically on Judgment Day bring them, because He is most just, He would bring them basically into that resurrection and divide basically the rights and make sure that that injustice does not prevail. Okay, this is where we left off at. والذين كذبوا بآياتنا صم وبكم في الظلمات. Here, this is right here. Okay, من يشاء الله يضلله ومن يشاء يجعله على صراط مستقيم. Okay, and القرطبي wanted to continue within this ayah. قل أرأيتكم إن أتاكم عذاب الله أو أتتكم الساعة أغير الله تدعون إن كنتم صادقين. Do you see if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's torments basically had come to you, or the hour had come to you? Is it other than the Lord Almighty that you would invoke? Well, as a matter of fact, you would invoke Him, and then the Lord Almighty would basically reveal or uplift what you were invoking Him for, and you would forget these creatures that you used to associate partners with. Okay, let's just break it down with Tafsir al-Qurtubi and see what he says. He said, well, when we're speaking about وَالَّذِينَ كَذَّبُوا بِآيَاتِنَا صُمٌّ وَبُكْمٌ, that they're basically some basically means that this person is deaf. So if they're deaf and they're bukum and they cannot process basically and they can't even speak right, then why are they held accountable? This is metaphorical. This is not literal. This is metaphorical, that they have the ability to hear, but they cannot process understanding what they're hearing from the ayat. So this is metaphorical. So therefore, they basically lost the usage of using their potential. So they had become as if they were basically deaf and blind and could not basically figure out how to find the inspiration, how to find guidance to what really benefited them. And that's the same thing that the disbelievers did not benefit and get the best of that benefit of hearing the dhikr, hearing the inspiration, hearing the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and seeing the miracles. Okay, so what happens to them if they're basically blind and deaf and can't even use it in a way that would fit the purpose that they were created for? So what would they be living in? في الظلمات. They would be living in darkness. Is this a literal thing, or is this metaphorical? Okay, so here he said, well, it would be literal if this was talking about Judgment Day. So it would be that on Judgment Day, they would be living in darkness because the light of whatever good deeds that they were doing was going to be like the torch, like the flashlight that was going to light in the darkness. So at one point in the hereafter, people would be living in pitch black darkness. And the only light that would radiate would basically be the light that would come from their good deeds. So the good deeds and the person himself would glow in order to even find the way to Jannah. Ya Rabbi, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us this light. The other interpretation that this, well, basically, if we're speaking about that pitch black, so the disbelievers would basically, in this dunya, they didn't get to that guidance. They were blind from seeing the miracles, recognizing the centricity goes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not their arrogance. And they were basically deaf from hearing the inspiration. So they lived in darkness, meaning that they lived in a life where they're really confused about their choices, confused about the principles, confused in understanding and finding the way to the purpose that they were created for. So therefore, they are metaphors metaphorically living in darkness in this life, and in the hereafter, it's going to be literally living in darkness, because on Judgment Day, there would be some stations that are pitch black, and they would need the radiance of their deeds that they basically had to developed in this dunya in order to use it to lighten their path in the akhirah. So therefore, it's literal and metaphorical. What is the al-dhulumat anyways? So al-dhulumat can mean one, al-dhulmu dhulumat. The Prophet ﷺ had said, al-dhulm, transgression, is basically on Judgment Day, it becomes transgressions. In other words, you transgress a limit and then it becomes leading you to another transgression. Wait, how do you understand that? And why not just say it's darkness? That's another meaning too. Well, let me take you to this ayah. Let's just remember page 141. Okay, we're going to go to Surah Al-Layl for a bit. Let's go to Surah Al-Layl. We're going to find it, inshallah, right? And let's go. So here's Juzu Amma. We're going to find Surah Al-Layl. Okay, well, not that far. We're going to find it, inshallah. Okay, here's Surah Al-Layl. I want you to look at this one. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Inna sa'yakum la shatta. That verily, your investments are diverse. They vary from one person to another. And what choices they would make, it would vary from one person to another. One would choose faith, the other would choose perhaps not choose the path of faith. The other one might actually mix a piece of faith and a piece of dunya and basically just have different choices. But look at that. فَأَمَّا مَنْ أَعْطَى وَاتَّقَى. As for those that had invested within their faith and they had given in order to live the value. So what did they do? They basically made a trade-off. What is the trade-off? Well, the trade-off was to give from their dunya in order to get the akhirah. So they gave from their money in donation in order to get the value. What is the value? The value of tazkiyah. Okay. And ittaqa, what did they do? They had to give in a lot of different things, perhaps maybe buying a house using mortgage or probably their dunya. So they could have lived a nice, peaceful life in the US, but then they decided to probably move to a poor country with less privileges because they wanted the akhirah. And they wanted their children to basically grow in their deen. So they had to give up on a lot of different privileges, or perhaps they gave up on, or this sister, let's use that sister, that yes, she got a scholarship to study at this and that university. It's a prestigious university, but she gave up on that opportunity because to her, the real opportunity is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be content over her. And she didn't want to be without a mahram. So she decided to put down that opportunity, quote unquote, and actually get the real opportunity for the akhirah. Now remember, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَنَبْلُوَكُمْ بِالشَّرِّ وَالْخَيْرِ فِتْنَةً. Some shar, some evil is a trial, and so is some good. Some good is a trial too. So some good like money, and probably you got maybe an offer from somebody that is rich but lacking deen. Yeah, he's got the money, he's got maybe the looks too, but you're like, but he lacks deen. I'm looking for somebody that would guide me to akhirah. So what am I doing? I'm basically considering the paradigm that is akhirah, and I'm using this trade-off. I'm giving up on a lot of things for dunya because I want to take in consideration the fear in akhirah. So that's basically a'ta wa taqa wa saddaqa bil husna. Now, صدق بالحسنى actually means one, to believe in Jannah, or to believe basically in Tawheed. Okay, when you're talking about believing in Tawheed, you're talking about صدق بالحسنى, to believe in Islam, to believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and all of that. But I want you to look at one thing. It basically put أعطى واتقى before even صدق بالحسنى. and didn't do it the other way, صدق بالحسنى and then أعطى واتقى, which is actually a very important indication that when you speak about a person's behavior, that's also going to affect their ability to recognize to recognize guidance. In other words, the person that is living a life of major and minor sins, they're going to find it harder to find guidance than a person that is probably not doing so well in their Islam, but they're avoiding major sins. They're avoiding major sins. They're probably they're praying, but they're not doing zina. They're not drinking. They're not doing these major sins, but they got their minor sins and plenty of minor sins. The person that has no major sins is going to find that connection. Let's call it a gravity towards khair, and their ability to live closer to taqwa is going to be a lot easier than the person that probably had already been addicted to certain major sins. The person that was addicted to major sins is definitely going to be finding a bigger struggle. In other words, whether the person was a believer or a disbeliever, the person that is a disbeliever is going to find it harder to find the right path compared to the person that probably had some idea to figure out the religion and figure out at least the right path. So when you look at صدق بالحسنى, if they were to embrace al-husna, embrace basically the tawheed, embrace Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's deen. And I want you to look at this one. Remember in Surah Al-Fatiha, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically teaching us to say, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. I want you to look at this one. There are two categories that it said, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ. It is you that we worship. And it is you that we seek refuge in. So wait a minute. We're doing two types of worship here? Or are we doing two types of relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here? Yes. In the lens of al-ubudiyya, in the lens of submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you're basically letting your free will find that connection with iyyaka nasta'in. It is you that we would seek refuge in and basically find guidance in how to find principle. And that takes us to فَسَنُيَسِّرُهُ لِلْيُسْرَى. The person that is living right there, al-ubudiyya, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ, and they were living that in إِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ, and living the stronger the principle, they would invest from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's principle in life, the easier it would be upon them to find the right path. And let's say at least maybe perhaps grow in the right path. And that's why the ayah said, فَسَنُيَسِّرُهُ لِلْيُسْرَى, that they would find an easy path to get to Jannah, to get to ease, basically. Okay, now what does that mean? So it would be easier on a person that is probably doing their 5 daily prayers to grow in certain, let's call it extra credit actions like qiyam al-layl, perhaps maybe do da'wah, maybe attend not one lecture, but hey, attending the lecture every single day. What happened? How were they capable of doing it? Well, they were capable of doing it because that good deed that you would invest in here and there, and the more consistent and the more committed you are, the stronger the enhancement that basically is given to you to be able to grow and perhaps even go higher in your level and perhaps even do qiyam al-layl. The ones that are only capable of doing one class, and they're like, I can do one class, but I can't do two. then we would say, okay, do one class, and hopefully that one class that you would do will give you the ability and the strength and the stamina to grow in your ability little by little. Where did we get that inference from? From this one. فَسَنُيَسِّرُهُ لِلْيُسْرَى. It's basically going to help you grow and elevate you and your levels until you would get to the highest levels of Jannah. But what does it need? It needs the stamina, the grit, the consistency, the investment, and basically from you. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Ankabut, He says, وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا. And those that would struggle for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even for if it was one thing, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا. We would guide them to our paths. Paths, not one, but many. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَهُدُوا إِلَى الطَّيِّبِ مِنَ الْقَوْلِ وَهُدُوا إِلَى صِرَاطِ الْعَزِيزِ الْحَمِيدِ. And they were guided to the right words, and the right words guided them to the right guidance, place of guidance. What does it start with? Well, it starts with the words. It starts with what are you listening to? It starts with what are you looking at? هدوء إلى الطيب من القول. Is it الطيب من القول that they were saying the right things? Or is it الطيب من القول, in other words, the good things that are described as good, meaning sadaqah is good, for example, that's what they were doing, and they were sharing a smile, that's what they were doing. All of that is what would be a good description. Okay. وَأَمَّا مَنْ بَخِلَ وَاسْتَغْنَى. As for those that were stingy and basically lived in arrogance, I want to look at, it didn't say that they were أغنياء, it said istaghna. And I want to remember that alif, sin, ta would mean to acquire, to request, to search for something, to demand something. And the word was basically saying istana. What were they demanding? They thought that they were going to be independent. They thought that they were living in wealth and all of that, but what they didn't recognize is that they thought that they were going to be getting that self-centricity, that they were getting the pride and what basically fills their ego and all of that, but they were just seeking it, but they didn't really have it. And this isn't saying that they didn't have the arrogance, because arrogance in Lugha Arabiya, when you say istaghna, that means they were seeking as an exaggeration, like a hyperbole of what they really are, but they didn't really recognize that they visualize something big about themselves, but the true matter and the true reality is that they're actually not that big. They exaggerated their potentials, they exaggerated probably their status, but the truth of the matter, that's not where they were at. But they were basically so focused in seeing their potentials that they thought it was greater than others' potentials. They were exaggerating and looking at the different things that they had, and they thought that that was going to somehow give them the social status, give them the power, etc. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, well, those that were stingy, they didn't want to give and invest in value, but they wanted to keep matter. And they also had exaggerated the matter about themselves and exaggerated their status, exaggerated perhaps who they are, etc. And then they lived in that arrogance. What did that lead to? كذب بالحسنى. Then they denied basically the good, the principles that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent, the revelation. They ended up denying all of that. What did that lead to? فَسَنُيَسِّرُهُ لِلْعُسْرَى. Then they're going to be finding it easy to basically go the wrong path. Now, when you look at this one, this ayah, was it 141? Is that what we were doing? Yes, alhamdulillah. Okay, here we go. So that basically relates to the ayah that we were working on. Is that, where was it? من يشاء الله يضلله ومن يشاء يجعله على صراط مستقيم. Whoever the Lord Almighty wills that they would get misguidance, they would basically get misguidance. And whoever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills that they would get guidance and get to the right path, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically will make it easy on them. But here's one thing. So can we say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala predetermined that person is going to choose Jannah or going to choose hellfire, and therefore we can't hold them accountable because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala predetermined that, and they were just doing things outside of their ability. It's that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created a certain strong desire probably for sexuality in that person, and they engaged in zina, and the other person I guess, desire for intoxication or whatever it is, and it doesn't happen like that. You may have variance in fitna. Your fitna might be slightly different from somebody else's fitna. Like what? So we all agree on certain things that are considered challenging for us. Okay, such as, for example, if we're talking about the DNAIM, remember that acronym, the Deen, the Nafs, the Aql, okay, the Ird, the Mal. Okay, we talked about this before. So yes, basically for our nafs, it's part of our instinct, perhaps, that we would worry about, perhaps ourselves, and we would basically somehow feel that in order for me to survive, I have to be the fittest, and I have to ensure that my life, the different means to sustain my life is basically under control, or else I'll lose my life. So what happens, looking at the world in that animal and materialistic materialistic vision on an angle, what would happen? I would then become impulsive. And I would become so impulsive because I'm feeling endangered. So whenever somebody might attack or probably wrong me in any way, if I were to live based on akhirah not existent, then we're going to find ourselves just having this gluttony to feed whether our hunger or whether our interest, because we would think that we're living in this dunya for this dunya and nothing to be concerned about the akhirah. And therefore, whenever anybody quarrels with me or probably competes with me, I'll basically get in the way and use all my power to compete with this person and prevent them from that. So that's one thing, that we share this fear of death. We share this fear of losing the means to probably give us a sustainable living. We share that. It's part of our instinct. Well, that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had made the preservation of nafs as sacred, because we all share it. Number two, mental health. We all have the the susceptible, we're all susceptible, and we all have basically the different things in our brain. If we were, for example, to get exposed to perhaps the curiosity to see the taste of alcohol, perhaps, or to drink it, or whatever it is, and we all have that curiosity. We all have that fitna. We all share it. Certainly, person A, maybe if they were to drink, might not get as intoxicated as person B, but in the end, we are all susceptible to getting basically intoxicated if we were to take certain substances. So therefore, the same thing, that if such substances were available, then we would all be susceptible to getting addicted. So therefore, this one would tell us that you've got similar fitnas. A certain fitna that you and I have is basically a fitna of addiction. We're all susceptible to it. Three, we're all susceptible to having that sexuality and the desire growing stronger, and probably whether it's different sex or whether it's same sex or whatever it is, we all have that desire can be something that can overcome us because it's part of our instinct to basically reproduce and seek that lust fulfilled. So yes, we all have that desire. Yes, we vary. Some people don't, they don't have it as strong as others, but we would vary. But in the end, is that we're speaking about the majority. We're speaking about almost everybody. And finally, wealth. Our recognition of the importance of wealth because we want to sustain life. We would recognize that property and ownership basically helps us live, whether it's a social status or whether it's getting the means to survival, etc. We recognize money. We recognize the importance of it in our life, and therefore, we would see that money is a key thing that we need to contain, we need to have, we need to maintain, so we would all be susceptible to the fitna of probably finding different ways to get a hold of money. Different ways. It could be legal and illegal ways if available or if we had the opportunity to get there. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us right there that certain things, all human beings, they would basically share a certain fitna. But certain levels, they would vary from one person to another. One person is probably having a stronger desire to something. Well, why? Well, there could be different factors. One factor could be a lifestyle that they had made that perhaps desire stronger in them. That's one fitna. Okay. That could have been a reason. But then another reason could be because of genetic factors. Genetic factors can be a reason. So if it's my ancestors, then I know we're even genetic factors. Why would I be held accountable for a genetic factor? Let's break it down. When you're looking at deeds, you would usually think if I had person A, person B, and person C, and let's say both are donating $400, okay? Or all are donating, A, B, and C, they're all donating $400. We would think the reward is going to be the same. That the reward, let's say $400 makes let's use, hypothetically speak right here, let's use a currency or some kind of a, I guess, some kind of a, what do they call that? وحدة, like, I don't know. So let's use some kind of a way to measure, I guess, deeds. Let's just say 400 credits. Okay, so 400 credits. But person B didn't get 400 credits for the same amount of those $400 that they donated. How much did they get? Oh, they got 1,400 credits. And what about say, oh, they got 18,000. Well, we donated the same amount. Why did they get more and the other person got more? Because of a number of different factors. The struggle is a factor, the higher the struggle, and certainly the person is also going to be taking, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, sorry, is going to be taking in that consideration that the person had to invest in making that struggle, or basically that investment and how much they put in the effort. That's taken into consideration. What else? Their piety. the piety of a person can give them extra credit? Yes. Think of it. In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, He tells them what? He tells them that يا نساء النبي لستن كأحد من النساء. The wives of the Prophet, peace be upon him, basically, wives of the Prophet, you're not like any other woman. If you were to commit a sin, it's going to be double the sin. And if you commit a good deed, it's going to be double the reward. And that's why there are certain things to take in consideration. So for a person that invested in seeking ilm, you're a woman that attends Gems of Light. Yeah, you will. Since you attend Gems of Light, certain sins are not befit that you would commit because you're a Gems of Light attendee. You know better. You attend those classes and you're committed to attending those classes. You know better. If the other people are doing that, it does not befit you. You're a hafiz al-Quran. No, you can't do that. Then the sin would be bigger, but the good deed would also be multiplied because you memorize the Quran. So when you memorize the Quran, for example, the good deed that you would do is going to be of a higher credit than a person that didn't memorize the Quran. Similarly, the sin that you would do would basically be not multiplied per se, but it would have a stronger influence on you as well. So you really have to take certain steps seriously because the higher that you grow, whether in your deen or whether in the ilm, etc., think of it as, the older that you get, there are certain sins that the Prophet ﷺ, for example, had said that zina on an older person is worse than zina on a younger person. Because zina on an older person, you recognize the consequence of this. Your drive is even less than a younger person. Why would you engage in such an act? Why would you put such an act at all as something that you would let your drives control you to something like that? It's not that we're giving justification for a younger person, not whatsoever. It's a sin, it's a sin. We're not giving justification, but we're taking in certain factors that their drive is stronger, your drive is weaker. But if your drive is weaker, but you didn't control even a weaker drive to do the right thing, you got a problem. You got a problem. So let's look at another factor. Place could be another factor why certain deeds, for example, you do dhikr in the masjid, you get a different reward than doing dhikr perhaps at home. Read Quran in the masjid, you would get the reward different than probably doing it at home. You perhaps committing a certain sin in the masjid, the sin is basically bigger if you were to commit it at the masjid than outside of that masjid. It's quite interesting. Okay, let's continue. So when you say مَن يَشَإِ اللَّهُ يُضْلِلْهُ, it's not that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forced them to do that, but it's that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, your will does not go beyond the will that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created in this world. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created a will in this world. Remember, He's the one that created things in nature. He's the one that created nature. So your nature, basically desires, basically genetic things that were created and passed on from your ancestry. So definitely a person that grew up in a religious household, let's say the different tools to helping their children find guidance is definitely a lot more available than perhaps a person that grew up in a household that was weak in their deen. The challenge is going to be bigger on them. Why? Because whether it's time, investment, or even genetics. We would know certain families, for example, they're just known to being gamblers. Other families, they're known to having addiction issues. Other families, they're known to having perhaps a history of violence and etc. And then even studies would tell you if your father had entered prison, then the probability and the possibility of you entering prison is basically going to grow stronger. A child basically seeing their father, engage in domestic violence against their mother, they're more likely to practice it in their life. Is it genetics? Well, they might have the anger factor, but if they don't learn how to change that, then that susceptibility is going to continue. But that doesn't mean that they were forced to do it. Same thing if you were to look at different traits. Different traits, you would have certain families, they're families of doctors. They're all doctors. They all have these genetic trait of, I guess, learning and being smart and basically being doctors. Okay, we have that a lot in Palestine, in Syria. There's certain families that are just eye doctors or business people. My family is all in business, and mashallah, very well off in business. And they can get into this business and boom, right there, they're already millionaires. They're all business people, really smart in business, and they definitely know how to do it. Okay. I tried to get into that. I definitely don't have a brain of a businesswoman. Definitely don't. Okay. But anyhow, you have other families, they basically have the mindset of being doctors, etc. So when you look at that, it takes me to the hadith, al-Mundhir ibn al-Ashaj ibn Qais. I always remember that hadith, and it just I can't stop thinking about it. When the Prophet ﷺ tells Al-Mundhir ibn al-Ashaj ibn Qais, he tells him that there are two traits in you that Allah and His Messenger love. We talked about this numerous times. And he said, what are they? And he said, al-hilm wal-ana. It's having al-hilm, basically that gentleness, forbearance, and being gentle, and and then um, that Sahabi said, well, are they things that I had grown in myself? Or are they things that, grown meaning disciplined myself into them? Or are they traits that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put into me? He said, but they're traits that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Prophet ﷺ responded, they're traits that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put into you. So that would actually mean there are certain traits that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would put into you, and you just have to preserve them and you make them grow. There are certain traits that are good traits that are put in you, and certain traits they can be acquired. So can I be perhaps, even though I come from a family of business people, we're just using it based on that, okay? I come from a family of business people, but then can I use, I guess, the business intelligence maybe that my family has to probably using that intelligence if I were to invest in probably learning fiqh or probably learning maybe medicine? Is that possible? It is possible. It's basically a muscle. Think of it as a muscle. Think of it as something similar to a muscle. It's what you invest in that's going to make it grow. Yes, you have the genetic component, and certainly I may not be the person that is maybe as skilled or probably as those that basically come from a family of doctors. Maybe I won't be as good as them, maybe because, hey, they had a family of doctors, their conversations were always talking about medicine and all of that, and that basically would help in enhancing their skill. Okay, but that doesn't mean I can't be a doctor. Well, it means, can my family help me grow that in me? Yes, it can. You may not have the strong genetic component, but you do have the ability to acquire and enhance, let's call it a hidden gene within you. Okay, a hidden gene within you to make it grow stronger. Okay, let's see. The sister is asking, do you think the susceptibility, okay, you know the word, is increased because the individual also internalizes and assumes that they will become and end up just like their past lineage? That pattern will continue. So here's one thing. If the person lived thinking that I am predestined to living this lineage and basically all our family is like this and therefore I'm just going to be basically like them and not change, then that's a fitna that they're living in. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that no, mayyasha, that's a clear word right there. Mayyasha yudlil. And وَمَن يَشَأْ يَجْعَلْهُ عَلَى صِرَاطٍ مُسْتَقِيمٍ. Who is the one that's making a will here? Is it مَن يَشَأْ اللَّهُ يُضْلِلْ? Is it Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala making the will? Or is it that you also make a will and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically, or that will that you wanted to invest, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created within nature that you invest a certain amount of investment, and that's basically what's going to determine what direction it goes for. Let's give an example. You decided to plant a seed to basically get an apple tree. Okay? You would basically worked, you put that seed, you basically were reading about the right soil, the right nutrients that are needed, the right heat, the right, well, temperature, the right amount of water, all these different things, and then boom, here it is. What's going to happen? Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created certain laws in nature, and you basically learned about that and you learned how to grow it, and the crop is most likely going to grow. Did you make it grow? Yes, you made it grow, but you're not the one that determined the laws of, I don't know, the laws that would make, that would make the plants basically grow, etc. But you invested in in making that environment suitable for that plant to grow. Same thing. The seed is there. The seed is there. You can have a seed to grow in for hidayah and guidance, and you can grow and basically water the seed to basically grow in the wrong way. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala use that seed as an example and said, وَالَّذِي خَبُثَ لَا يَخْرُجُ إِلَّا نَكِدًا. And he said, in terms of الطيب, يخرج نباته بإذن ربه. The good seed would basically, by the Lord Almighty's will, it would come out as a good plant. And the ones that were bad seeds from the beginning, they did not crop well, then in that situation, لا يخرج إلا نكدة. It's going to continue basically the wrong plantation. From the very start, how did you grow it? Did you work on it? Perhaps a person comes from a family of maybe not necessarily religious, maybe a family of that. Certainly, that fitna is going to be different than someone else that probably grew in a different environment, but it does not mean that you're not capable or you're disabled from growing that good seed in yourself. Or else, why would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hold us accountable if this is something that I have no control over? So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, مَن يَشَأِ اللَّهُ يُضْلِلْ. Well, basically, you put in the investment if that person had chosen, okay, and the disbeliever chose to basically stay living in misguidance, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically allow them. You chose that path. Sure, I'm going to let your free will on its own. You determine what you want, and then eventually that's going to lead you to a certain path. And the same thing, مَن يَشَأْ يَجْعَلْهُ عَلَى صِرَاطٍ مُسْتَقِيمٍ. And whoever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically guide them to the right path. What is Sirat al-Mustaqim? Is it Sirat al-Mustaqim on Judgment Day, meaning that Sirat, the bridge that's over the hellfire and basically passes, yesterday, and basically, it wasn't yesterday. Let's look at that one. I came across this one. I absolutely loved it. Let's look at it. Absolutely loved it. Okay, let's see. So death happens, and then with death, you've got the believers, basically the green path right there. Okay, they'll go through a certain let's call it bounty, let's call it reward in their grave. Okay, so this is the grave. And then the believer would be dwelling in some kind of a bounty, some kind of a reward in the grave. The disbeliever would basically, they put it in red to mean basically torment. Nasallahu alaihi wa afiyah. Then they would both go under in nafkh fasur. They would face basically that day, the station of that horn basically blown, and then al-bath, and then the resurrection, and then the basically people being gathered, that's believer and disbeliever, and then there's the shafa'ah, then there's the intercession, then there's the accountability, and then there are those books that would be flying over our heads, and then there's the scale that would weigh the good deeds and the bad deeds, and then there is the lake which is the lake of that water, the al-Kawthar, that would basically come from Jannah, and then the believers would be taken from that. And then there's the trial for the believers. Wait a minute, so where are the disbelievers? If they're not going through here, where are they going? They just fell right here in hellfire, or they would be going to the station, a sirat, in order to cross over a sirat. And then, well, that's not the end of it. Even if they were to pass this bridge right here, which basically is right above hellfire, and every single person, when they pass a sirat, they're not the same. Some people are passing it swiftly, others are passing it like thunder, others are passing it like they were basically knights running or racing. Others will pass it with a blink of an eye. Others will pass it, and then the different hooks basically on that bridge will eventually hook onto their legs and take them inside the hellfire. And then there's al-Qantara, which basically is, you would see the believers, they might fall in some dispute between each other, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they won't make it to Jannah. Well, first we have to figure out the dispute between the believers and figure out basically what we're going to deduct of deeds and good deeds, and what we're going to add in basically in rewards and etc. And in order for them to be determined on what level of Jannah will they get to. Ya Rabbi, Ya Rabbi, Allahumma arzuqna al-Jannah. Okay, so that was a little bit of that. Let's say, how did we get to that one? So that's basically in order for us to see. Okay, let me just make sure that we're okay. Here we go. So مَن يَشَأْ يَجْعَلْهُ عَلَى صِرَاطٍ مُسْتَقِيمٍ, meaning on the path of Islam. Okay, in other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not force you to do what is wrong or what is right. It's you in basically doing what's right. Remember how we did before? فَأَمَّا مَنْ أَعْطَى وَاتَّقَى وَصَدَّقَ بِالْحُسْنَى. You put in that investment from your actions to do what's right, and it's basically going to help you find the guidance. قُلْ أَرَأَيْتَكُمْ. Okay, where is it? قُلْ أَرَأَيْتَكُمْ إِنْ أَتَاكُمْ عَذَابُ اللَّهِ أَوْ أَتَتْكُمُ السَّاعَةُ أَغَيْرَ اللَّهِ تَدْعُونَ إِن كُنتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. I would hate to stop here because that's a scary ayah. Oh, I can't stop here. No, wait, this is impossible. Okay, قُلْ أَرَأَيْتَكُمْ. He said that there are different qira'at. Now, remember with qira'at, it usually falls within the hamza. Or, within the hamza. So is it أَرَأَيْتَكُمْ, or is it أَرَأَيْتَكُمْ, or is it رَيْتَكُمْ? So you will say, let's say right here, She said you can't control the variables, but you can control some of the choices within your capacity. Love it. Yeah. You can right. So that's a good one. Let's see. Is the qantara before sirat or after? القنطرة is after الصراط, dear. القنطرة is after الصراط. Okay? All right. قل أرأيتكم, and let's say he said Nafi had read it in تخفيف الهمزتين. So أرأيتكم. Okay, that was a تخفيف. Okay. The second one, let's say right there. The second one, basically ورش. Basically أرأيتكم. Okay. I'm just going to skip over this one because I'm not the person specialized in this. Let's see. Abu Amr and Asim, they read it أرأيتكم بتحقيق الهمزتين أرأيتكم. So both hamzas were basically right there. Let's see. الكسائي and Isa ibn Amr or Umar, أرأيتكم. أرأيتكم. Okay. Do they give a different meaning? No, it's just a different dialect. So it doesn't affect the meaning, but I wanted to share it. I guess kind of get the inspiration of Dr. Samia, you know, getting the inspiration of Dr. Samia, but I can't be as good as her. She's outstanding. Okay, in atakum. Okay, I'm going to skip that one because it's related to linguistics and basically related to Arabic grammar, which it would be extremely hard for me because I'm not a specialist and I'm not an expert in English language, so I wouldn't really know the equivalents in, the Arabic grammar. I do better in Arabic grammar than English grammar, believe it or not. And I'm not the best in Arabic grammar either. Okay. أو أتتكم الساعة. Okay, so read it again. قل أرأيتكم إن أتاكم عذاب الله. Do you see if the torments of Allah Almighty had come to you, or the hour had come to you? Who would you invoke other than Allah Almighty if you were really honest with? What does it mean in kuntum sadiqin? In kuntum sadiqin, that's because they had said that they believe in these gods and that these gods are basically what is going to give them that investment, an investment in empowerment, that's basically what is going to give them salvation and all of that. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was saying, okay, well, but speaking of which, since you guys believe that it's going to give you salvation, let's speak about some of those situations if you were to live in them. If you had a torment, basically like a tornado, a thunder probably went into some kind of a hard thing, or even if you were to basically get death, are you going to ask for salvation or for help from this idol? Or are you going to say, oh God, help me? You're going to say, oh God, help me. You're not going to say, you're not going to invoke a deity other than the Lord Almighty. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was letting them, it's a question, but not really an interrogative question. It's more of an informative clause right there to let them just recognize the reality of what is it as part of their instinct. Okay, so that's why it said, وَالْآيَةِ فِي مُحَاجَّةِ الْمُشْرِكِينَ. In other words, it's right there in order to debate and basically expose the disbelievers because it's part of their instinct. And since they would recognize and they would believe that he is the creator, but then they would go worshiping something else. In other words, if you recognize that's who you would turn to in a situation of calamity, in a situation of hardship, then from the start, you should recognize that you should turn to the Lord Almighty on Judgment Day. Basically, you would have no option but to turn to the Lord Almighty on Judgment Day because there's nothing more magnificent and harder than Judgment Day. Then if this dunya, if a calamity were to happen, you were to invoke the Lord Almighty, and then how is the Judgment Day going to be any different? It's not going to be any different because you're going to be wanting to invoke the Lord Almighty, but it's too late. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling them, well, don't insist on associating partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because there's going to come a time where you're going to really reach out to the one that would only have the power to give you salvation, and that is Allah. And if you're not practicing that now, then blame none but yourself. بَلْ إِيَّاهُ تَدْعُونَ. As a matter of fact, you would invoke the Lord Almighty alone, and He would be the one to uplift ad-dur. And the one that has the ability to uplift harm is basically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you would disregard or forget when this calamity happens, or probably the punishment happens. You would basically forget all about those deities, or probably those idols that you were worshiping, or those different things that you had worshipped. You would forget all about them, because you would recognize that you lost hope in these things bringing any salvation to themselves, let alone you. And therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically lets us know. Let's see this one. He said in here in Nahas, or I guess is Zajjaj as well, wanted to say tansawna ma tushrikun. Wanted to emphasize on the word tansawna. Okay, why did you guys want to emphasize on that word? So the question is, when the disbelievers, they would associate partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is it that they had disregarded, or is it they had forgotten? So when you look at the ayah, nasullaha fanasiyahum, they had forgotten Allah, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had what? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgotten them? Or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala disregarded them? Oh, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not forget. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not forget. But let's look into the other ayah. وَلَقَدْ عَهِدْنَا إِلَى آدَمَ مِنْ قَبْلُ فَنَسِيَ وَلَمْ نَجِدْ لَهُ عَزْمًا. وَلَقَدْ عَهِدْنَا إِلَى آدَمَ مِنْ قَبْلُ فَنَسِيَ. I'm going to go to this ayah. Okay, we're going to find it. It's 115 in Surah Taha. This is a key ayah. 115 Surah Taha. We're going to find Surah Taha. Surah Taha is going to be, am I right here? No, Shara, we're going to go to Surah Taha. Qasas, am I going the right direction? No. Surah Taha is going to be right after Surah Maryam, I guess. Right there. Am I right? No, this is Surah An-Nur. God, after Surah An-Nur, Al-Mu'minun, they're going to get to Surah, right, Al-Hajj. Okay, am I going the right direction here? Okay. You know, sometimes, okay, we're going to find it, right? Here it is. Okay, and what are we doing? Ayah 115. Let's get to that one, because this is a key one in understanding that genetic component, in understanding what we're susceptible into doing. Okay, let's say, what happened? فَقُلْنَا يَا آدَمْ إِنَّ هَذَا عَدُوٌّ لَكَ وَلِزَوْجِكَ. Wait a minute, right here. فَتَعَالَى اللَّهُ الْمَلِكُ الْحَقُّ وَلَا تَعْجَلْ بِالْقُرْآنِ مِنْ قَبْلِ أَنْ يُقْضَى إِلَيْكَ وَحْيٌ وَقُلْ رَبِّ زِدْنِي عِلْمًا. And do not rush, telling the Prophet ﷺ, and say that all the truth comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And do not rush in reading the Quran before it was revealed onto you, and make the dua, Ya Allah, increase me in ilm. Okay. وَلَقَدْ عَهِدْنَا إِلَى آدَمَ مِنْ قَبْلِ فَنَسِيَ وَلَمْ نَجِدْ لَهُ عَزْمًا. What happened? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us the story in, kind of like a trailer, because then it would start from the story from the beginning. So this is the trailer right there. This is the trailer right there, and said, well, we had given Adam a certain ahidna. In other words, there was a covenant that he was supposed to be committed to, but the word that it used is fanasi. Fanasi. Does that mean he had forgotten the covenant that he was asked to commit to? Or does that mean that he disregarded the covenant? وَلَمْ نَجِدْ لَهُ عَزْمًا. And we did not find that azm. What is al-azm? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't find al-azm in him. What is al-azm? Al-azm is the determination to do something. Okay, so what happened? Well, this is a key word This word is a key word to help us understand this key word. And why did we get into this ayah? Because are we predetermined genetically, whether it's the society, how do we understand all of this? Are we weak because a genetic component and it's not my fault? Or is it that, no, you have a certain investment? In other words, you share a certain factor, you share a certain contribution to why you're living like this, why you're finding it hard. So these are the two words that are important here. When it said ahidina, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically put in a principle, certain principles, certain borders. He was not supposed to be eating from a specific tree. It was simple and straightforward. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically given us, well, this is Adam. What does that mean? You are the son of Adam. And since you are the son of Adam, there's a genetic component that you share with Adam. What is it? Fantasy. What is fantasy? That you may listen. So what did Adam do? He basically listened to the waswasa coming from a shaitan. What did in other ayat, it was telling us what he was telling him, and فَقَاسَمَهُمَا. He basically swore by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Adam thought, well, you look at him. He's so religious. Now he's basically connecting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this shaitan, he's making an oath by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the worst of the scammers and the worst of those are basically coming in religious appearance. Yes, baby. The ones that come in religious appearance are the most dangerous fitna, because they become so murky that you can't even identify them. Those are the worst people. It becomes something that you would really need a complete expert to really recognize that that person is nothing but a hypocrite. But then, fantasy, that's what we care about. Fantasy, in other words, did he forget about the covenant or did he disregard it? Well, he was taken by the words of that shaitan, and it basically affected him. So what happened? Remember, when you are susceptible to committing a fitna, it depends on how much of exposure you would basically you would put yourself in. Depends on the exposure, depends on a certain genetic component, whatever, all of that. But if you expose yourself to hearing this kind of language, and you didn't say, didn't disregard what the shaitan is saying, you're not going to be any different, and you will basically find the words of shaitan growing stronger to the point that the information that you had known already about Iman, about faith, about Jannah, about Nar, it becomes like as if you had completely forgotten it. It would become disregarded. Fanasi. But what makes it disregarded? This is the key word. لَمْ نَجِدْ لَهُ عَزْمًا. He didn't have the determination. In other words, the determination, the stamina, that consistency, that's what creates a change. Even if you had a genetic component possibly getting you weaker, if you were to invest in that determination, I'm determined to become a doctor, I'm determined to become a hafidha, I'm determined to basically become a person of piety, I'm determined to go to Hajj, I'm determined to attend those classes. That's what's going to change even the component and the susceptibility that probably was in you. You put in the determination. Well, it's not just in deen, but that's the same thing. The determination that you probably invest in, maybe making a business, maybe experimenting something, maybe in your studies or whatever it is, that determination, that grit, That grit right there is the secret to all successes, including your deen. That's azm, including your deen, that grit. Do you have that grit? Do you have that consistency? Do you have that determination? I'm gonna memorize the Quran. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would tell us that the stronger the determination, that it's going to lead to commitment, and eventually it's going to lead to creating what identity are you. Okay, so just seeing that one, تنسون ما تشركون. Let's go back to our page right there. And of course, I want you to see this one. وَإِذْ قُلْنَا لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ اسْجُدُوا لِآدَمَ فَسَجَدُوا إِلَّا إِبْلِيسَ. Then the ayah would say, okay, well, let me tell you the story and how it begins and all of that. You know, I love how the ayah sometimes would give you like a trailer and then tell you the story. Let me tell you the story from the beginning, and then it would go in detail. But that's a different thing to talk about. Okay. And where were we? وَتَنْسَوْنَ مَا تُشْرِكُونَ, and you would forget what you basically had associated partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, we're going to now stop at وَلَقَدْ أَرْسَلْنَا إِلَى أُمَمٍ مِّن قَبْلِكَ فَأَخَذْنَاهُم بِالْبَأْسَاءِ وَالضَّرَّاءِ لَعَلَّهُم يَتَضَرَّعُونَ. We had sent to the different nations before you, and he said تسلية للنبي. تسلية doesn't mean, you know, in colloquial, I think it's called, slang Arabic, تسلية is like entertainment. This isn't to entertain, but this is to give support. Okay, this is to give support to the Prophet that the nations before you, they had basically come, in other words, with the message, with the different prophets. They had come to them and telling them of the different revelations, but then what they practiced was basically denial of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed. And they basically had taken the path other than the path of what their prophets and messengers were coming in to bring guidance to them. And then that affected them. And what does it affect? What happens? Al-Ba'sa. What is al-Ba'sa? So al-Ba'sa is generally any calamity that relates to wealth. So we're speaking about, what do you mean calamity that relates to wealth? Like poverty, for example. That's the relating to wealth. That's in books, is more of, what is that book called? Miserables, I think it was in French. We studied that book, the Miserables and all of that in books, basically. Okay, whatever. So al-Ba'sa is basically usually relating to wealth. So what is that inferring? That when people go out of the guidance of the Lord Almighty, what they will be facing is the different calamities in wealth. In other words, economical instability. That's the first thing, whether on an individual level or whether we're speaking about on a social level. الضراء. الضراء is basically just different illnesses, whether we're speaking about physical illnesses or mental illnesses. In other words, what? So what is this ayah inferring? That for those that had basically, let's see, look at right there. Let me erase all of this so we could look at it and really know where we're at, right? Let's see, here we go. This is going to be the last ayah that we're doing. Okay, بالبأساء والضراء. So the nations before, they basically had received the inspiration, but they, you know, right here, this is basically, you know, giving me a semicolon right there. In other words, they received the revelation, but, or actually I put the semicolon in the wrong place. Okay, the semicolon should be right there, okay? إلى من قبلك فأخذناهم بالبأساء والضراء. This is where the semicolon would fit. They had received the message, but then because they had rejected, did the ayah actually say because they had rejected? No, it didn't say because they had rejected, but just by looking at the context that they were basically left to struggle with poverty or economical instability, or الضراء, basically different illnesses, as coming as a punishment for what they had done, what they had committed, which is leaving the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's when they ended up basically living that struggle. لعلهم يتضرعون. And لعلهم يتضرعون. What does that mean? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inflicted them with economical instability and physical illnesses or mental illnesses, and that's to induce a certain strong relationship or strong, maybe it would motivate them to seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Is that what it means? فلولا إذ جاءهم بأسنا تضرعوا ولكن قست قلوبهم. But when that harm or that punishment had come to them, they basically had تضرعوا. They basically started, if they were to invoke Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and recognize this calamity, that there's no salvation but through Allah Almighty, but their hearts were hardened. And the shaitan had created the narrative, basically, زين لهم الشيطان, created certain narratives to make their behaviors seem like it was a noble behavior. Okay, so what happened? فَلَمَّا نَسُوا مَا ذُكِّرُوا بِهِ فَتَحْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ أَبْوَابَ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ. When they had forgotten what they were reminded of, which is what the prophets had come with, then they basically got all these different doors of probably prosperity, maybe economical, maybe political, whatever it is, basically open up at them. Here's one thing. There are so many different questions that come out of this one, but this one's quite interesting. In this one, Ibn Atiyah pointed this one out, that some ubad basically means those that would engage in ibadah, kind of mystical, maybe another word for that, not Sufi, but mystical. Okay. And they thought that in order for them to discipline themselves, that they needed to give away their wealth, they needed to mortify their body, basically, by perhaps getting into severe hunger, or probably not have the different things needed for life. And al-Qurtubi commented on this one, and he said that's mere ignorance, and this is misunderstanding the inference of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the inference in this ayah, and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is inferring in this ayah. And because the context of this ayah is to mention that was a uquba, that was basically a punishment, and this isn't a method to use in order to make the person become better. In other words, don't think that by living perhaps away from people, kind of like what monks do, that's going to make you a better believer. That's not what you're asked to do. You're not asked to give away everything in dunya to become a better believer, but you're asked to do it in moderation. You're asked to consider certain things as priorities, and there's a certain direction that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given us on how to make, whether it's the donation or how to make that commitment and all of that in order to grow in our deed. So we don't mortify the body or mortify our resources, or I guess this, end our resources to become better. Absolutely not. Hey, you want to make a dua to become a millionaire? May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us all millionaires. But we would, along with the dua, make the dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not make this khair be an ibtila. You remember the ayah, وَنَبْلُوَكُمْ بِالشَّرِّ وَالْخَيْرِ فِتْنَةً? that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically have that ibtila, basically have that test in what is good and what is bad. So yes, you can have $1 million, and that's probably going to be something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would test you with. And you could also be tested with poverty as well. Poverty is not any less of a test than perhaps wealth as well. And wealth is not any less. You might have the money, and basically that money is making you forget your akhirah, and it becomes a fitna. ونبلوكم بالشر والخير فتنة. Or is it نبلوكم بالشر and الخير is fitna? Different, different, uh, different interpretations that scholars had. Is it shar ibtila, or is khair fitna, or is that shar and khair, evil and khair, are all fitna? Okay, so just to note that one, because many would take from the inspiration of other religions, specifically the shamans, the Buddhists, and they would basically live as monks, or probably the Tao religion and Confucianism and all of that, and think that, okay, I'm going to mortify my resources and basically live away from everything. That's in order to grow my spirituality. We would say not too fast. That's not what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted you to do. That's not a way to discipline. You can reduce from your dunya to do taqashuf, but not mortify the resources, but you're basically not wanting to connect yourself to the dunya, but don't necessarily mortify it as, let's call it, as a goal. So if you wanted to lessen from dunya resources for yourself, you have the, let's call it, the net and the profit there, but you're not getting too much of it. You have the ability to buy food, you've got, and all of that, but you're basically doing that portion control because you want to grow stronger in your ibadah, or because you want to live healthy. You do have the means, you do have the money to probably eat more and a lot more, but then you're doing portion control because you recognize the benefit of it. And the same thing, you're living based on that amount biqadar, in the lens of Quran and Sunnah. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically says, Ya ayyuha rusul, kulu min at-tayyibati wa'amalu salihah. O prophets, that was the main thing. O prophets, eat from the good and do what is right. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, anfiqu min tayyibati ma kasabtum. Telling the believers, anfiqu, spend from the good. In other words, it's okay to get a Mercedes Benz, if that's basically what you would like to get. That's okay if you can afford it. And probably buy something that is of a good quality if you can afford it, even though it's a lot more expensive than probably something else, but you're able to afford it. That's permissible, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically said, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, kulu min tayyibati ma razaqnakum. And this is basically directed at the believers and the prophets as well. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically ordered the believers with the same discourse, with the same orders as the prophets and the messengers. The Sahaba were eating of what is tayyib. They would wear the best garment and even beautify themselves. And that was basically the tabi'in as well. So that was basically the legacy of all the prophets and, in fact, the messengers. And therefore, recognizing that and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given them is key. Okay? So if that's their legacy, well, we're not any better. Than we would have to live in the lens of how they lived. And the Prophet ﷺ had also forbid that we would fast each and every single day, even though we can probably do it. And that was called the wisal. Why did the Prophet ﷺ forbid wisal, fasting each and every single day? Because the price is going to be harmful on your body. And he had also forbid wandering money and or even giving the money to those that don't know how to use it right. لعلهم يتضرعون. What is الضراعة? ضراعة basically means to live in humility. Okay, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was giving them another opportunity by putting them in those struggles to basically recognize that Islam is the only way for salvation. Did they necessarily understand why things were becoming even harder on them and why the struggles? They're realizing, I guess, economical instability. They're realizing an increased rate of violence, increased rate of mental health issues, increased rate of illness, all of these different things. Is that letting them think that, hey, maybe we have to go back to the Sharia in order to help us cure our social problems, our economical, economical imbalances and all of that? Well, that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving them the opportunity, and that's what that is saying. Okay, so subhanak Allahumma bihamdik, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. I know we went into a lot, but hopefully, inshallah, we'll be continuing this and more on tafsir. Remember, I know we kind of went into a number of different ayat here and there, but remember, because when we want to do tafsir, we want to do it in the lens of other ayat as well. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to hear them, or even comments and commentary, things that you would like to say. Sorry, last night I was extremely busy. So, alhamdulillah, was capable of still getting onto our tafsir, so that's good news. Anybody would like to ask any questions? I'm listening. Bismillah. No? Okay. I'll basically